Welcome back. We've talked about how uh, America is really changing socially in the 1950s, but I think it's important to really talk about the other side of America as well. And so, in this unit or lesson, we are going to look at how Mexican Native Americans and to some extent African Americans face discrimination, and then what were cities like during this time. So what's going on? We've kind of touched upon this in class, but not everything was hunky dory like the 1950s image may seem. In fact, nearly 1 in 4 Americans were living under the poverty level, and most of the people who are considered poor come from urban areas and are minorities. Uh, the reason that cities are left with minorities and all the poor, mainly, is because of this idea of white flight. During this time, a lot of white families are getting money, they're getting good jobs, and as a result, they're leaving the cities and moving to the suburbs. You can see on the graph here, this illustrates it perfectly. At the start of the 50s, we're at 0% right here, this 0% line. And you can see as the decades are moving, more and more whites are moving out of the cities. There's definitely a downward trend, which when white families move out, the idea of white flight is that only the poor are left without resources and without a lot of tax money because that's what white families take with them. And that's why in cities, a lot of times you tend to see things like poor, a lot of minorities in one area, lacking resources. This goes back to the idea of white flight. Cities at this time are starting to become the major cities that we know today. Inner cities are where poverty grows exponentially. But at the 50s, during the 50s, I should say, people really didn't think that poverty was that big of an issue or something to worry about. I mean, how could people be poor? We're the richest nation on earth. It wasn't till social activists like Michael Harrington wrote books and exposed things that people really began to listen that there is a problem in America. Just because we are the richest nation on earth at this time doesn't mean we don't have problems. It doesn't mean that our minorities don't face a lot of daily problems as well. And you can see this graph here as an illustration between the income gaps between black families and white families. In the 1940s, there's a 40% gap between earnings, and by the time of 2000, so 60 years later, the turn of the millennium, there's close to an 80% income gap between the two races. And it goes back to this division here that white families are moving, they're taking advantage of resources and opportunities outside of the cities, and then taking all of the resources with them, unfortunately. And so, because of this problem, there was a move for urban renewal where many minorities were living in dirty, crowded, slum like conditions. And so, the government thought that if it passed the Housing Act of 1949 to provide a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family, that they could really rid the cities of these problems. If we can take the minority families or the poor families out of these slum-like conditions, they can prosper just as well. And that's a great idea, and when it works, it has been proven to work. The problem is that there really isn't enough housing for all of the families to be taken out. And what happens with the land that used to be slums, a lot of times they're torn down and turned into things like factories or parks or new housing developments or highways or parking, whatever it may be. This is an example here of the slums you see being ripped down to make way for new things to improve the community. And overall, this idea works. The problem is that there's simply not enough housing. And this is every housing dilemma developer's problem, is how to provide enough housing close to where the cities currently are, where the families work. So let's look at some specific minorities at this time, Mexican Americans in particular. It was during the 50s that Mexicans started to become citizens of the United States in large numbers. During World War I and World War II, there was a shortage of agriculture workers working in the southeast, And so many spots opened up for Mexicans to cross the border and work in American lands. A lot of them lived just over the U.S. and Mexican border a lot of times, and so it was easy to commute or to move across the border. And in fact, we needed the help of Mexicans so much that in 1942, the federal government created what's called the Braceros Project, in which Mexicans were allowed to enter the United States for the time of the war, a short term basis. For work, they'd be paid in US dollars, and then after they would return back to the United States. This doesn't really happen. A lot end up staying illegally in the United States. But it's during the 50s that they're gaining citizenship. They're becoming a bigger part of the economy and the government and really working into the fabric of American society at this time. Native Americans as well are facing some controversy. Just to give you a quick history, you have the Dawes Act last century that it was a policy of the United States government to assimilate or Americanize the Native Americans. And what you do is you take the children out of their Native American families, you put them in schools like you see here where they speak English only, they dress in American clothes, they learn about American history and values, and they forget their Native American heritage. It is the Snyder Act that in 1929, gives them the Native American citizenship in the United States. And in doing so, they are legally part of the United States, but they're still treated as second-class citizens. They're not treated as full Americans, which is probably not a surprise to you looking at the history of Native Americans. And then in 1934, you have the Indian Reorganization Act that moves from the policy of assimilation, making Native Americans, assimilate or become the same as Americans, to autonomy, which means that they're given their own land and the ability to govern themselves. And this all leads up to 1944 with the Congress of American Indians. And what they're doing is they're really trying to get the tribes and Native Americans together to do two things: ensure civil rights for all Native Americans, and then allow Native American reservations their own to retain their own customs. So that means when you live on a reservation, you don't have to be fearful about losing your rights or your identities, whatever that may be, because you are part of your culture, and your culture can. Native American continued to have a troubled time with the U.S. government because in 1953 the federal government declared an end of its responsibility to Native American tribes. This became known as the termination policy. We're going to terminate our business, our dealings, our government connections with the Native Americans, and in fact, they can be on their own. And in doing so, not only did the United States federal government cut ties with the Native Americans, but it ended economic support of all Native Americans. It ended reservations and took the lands and distributed them among the tribes. And so what are the outcomes from this program at this time? Well, the program was a huge failure. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is part of the federal government, tried to relocate more than 35,000 Native Americans to cities. They, of course, moved to urban areas because that's where there's space. And they oftentimes are unable to find jobs because they lack the skills that you may need in a city. They're used to living on reservations. Maybe they don't speak English. Some of them do. They face tons of discrimination. And overall, this policy was just in shambles. And so by 1963, this policy of termination was abandoned. And we go back to giving support to Native Americans. So let's review. This was a quicker one. What are some of the disadvantages? Well, Mexicans were forced to leave the country after World War II, or they should have, according to the U.S. government. They didn't, and so, all three groups are facing discrimination, but Mexicans at this time are really working to become U.S. citizens. Native Americans are troubled because they are losing all of the support from the U.S. government, and so they continue to be in a decade of turbulence. Their houses are being moved. They're given reservation lands that's being taken away. They're always in limbo, unfortunately. And African Americans, in general, we didn't really talk about them much, but they're primarily living in urban cities, they live in slum-like conditions. They don't have a lot of opportunities. And this is not to generalize the race, because that's not right. This wasn't the same for all African Americans, but it's at a high rate that African Americans are living in these conditions after the white flight. And what were cities like at this time? Well, you have white families leaving. You have any family, really with economic means, leaving. It tends to be the white families. This is white flight. They're moving to the suburbs, and they're leaving poor and minorities in the city, which are causing housing developments to deteriorate, causing slums, causing cities to really modernize into the cities that we know today, where there's a direct distinction between suburbs and cities. So I hope this video provided you with a better picture of what the other America looks like in the 1950s, not just the typical, American family during the 50s. We'll talk more about this in class. But until next time, Husky historians.